So what about for a veteran who has a seizure disorder prior to enlisting? I know sometimes I'll see somebody will have had childhood seizures, something like that. If symptoms worsen or reoccur in service, is it still possible that the veteran could have a claim there?
Yes. The issue is whether it falls within the category of aggravation. And try to make this as simple as I can. If you enter the service, they give you a physical before you start. And typically, they are supposed to examine you and determine if you have any existing medical conditions. And obviously, you're supposed to give them a medical history as well. If you enter the service, even with a history of epileptic seizures or any other condition, narcolepsy, whatever, they're supposed to determine whether that condition is disabling and they shouldn't take you or not.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Tony Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA. If you're a veteran struggling with the VA's disability system, or just want to make sure you're getting the benefits you've earned, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an update that could change your life. I'm Christian Terrison, here with renowned veterans disability attorney Francis Jackson of Jackson and MacNichol. Jack has dedicated his career to helping veterans like you win the benefits you deserve, recovering millions of dollars for thousands of heroes. This podcast isn't just for veterans navigating the system. It's for their families, their friends, and anyone else who wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who've served. So stick around, because we're here to make sure you get the support you need to succeed with your VA claim. Now, today's episode is about two conditions that I've actually never had come up in any of the cases I've done: narcolepsy and epilepsy. So, to begin at the beginning, how does the VA define and rate conditions like narcolepsy and epilepsy?
The rating system actually is based on epilepsy, and they rate narcolepsy by analogy to that. But the basis of the rating system for those conditions is on the frequency and severity of the episodes. So, as you know, epilepsy is primarily manifested by seizures. Mm-hmm. And you can have what are called grand mal seizures, which are quite severe, or petit mal seizures, which are typically much less obvious. Mm-hmm. Maybe an observer wouldn't see anything more than the person kind of looking blank and staring for a short period. But it's the frequency of those occurrences the VA uses as the rating basis for epilepsy and narcolepsy.
Okay. And, for narcolepsy, there's not an objective sort of lab test for it that I'm aware of. So how can a veteran prove the existence of the condition and how disabling it is?
Well, actually, there's no test for epilepsy either. It's all based on witnessed seizures. And so with narcolepsy in particular, generally takes quite a while to get a diagnosis. Mm-hmm. But let me start with epilepsy because it's a little easier. What the VA does is they require a diagnosis. They require witnessed seizures, meaning other people have seen the seizures, preferably a physician, but you can prove the seizures with them being witnessed by other people as long as the physician is convinced that's what's going on. And typically with grand mal seizures, there's not much question that's what's going on. Those are pretty dramatic. Mm-hmm. But with narcolepsy, what narcolepsy is a malady that simply causes people to fall asleep. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you fall asleep at the wheel of a car or climbing a ladder, it's a big deal. So the way that those get proven is just based on other people's observations of and testimony about these events where people just fall asleep in bizarre situations where you wouldn't expect anyone to fall asleep. And that happens consistently. You know, we all hear stories about people falling asleep at the wheel, but typically it's late at night, they've been driving a long time, may have had some alcohol, but for people who just, fall asleep at the wheel at 9 o'clock in the morning for no apparent reason, that can be a symptom of narcolepsy. And what will happen with narcolepsy is that people will just fall asleep in strange situations for, where they're being active or inactive. But the point is that they fall asleep even in situations where typically people would not.
So I know in cases I've worked on that have a sort of episodic symptomology, I'm thinking of, flare-ups of back pain, things of that nature. We'll ask our clients to keep a journal or a diary.
Yep.
But, that's different. You can write down when your back hurts.
Yep.
If you're having these types of episodes, can veterans employ a similar strategy and have, friends or family or whoever note the date, time, duration, etc.?
That's absolutely right. That is one of the best ways to do it. And typically it will be a spouse or, a parent or child who lives in the same household and sees these things on an ongoing basis. Spouse is most common, obviously, but anyone who is around the veteran on a consistent basis and can see these recurring events can make the record. In the VA, the seizures have to be witnessed or verified by a physician at some point. And when I say verified, you can have the physician be convinced that this person had a seizure. A classic example is the person has a seizure, falls, has injuries from the fall, gets carted off by the local ambulance, and the physician is convinced that, in fact, this is a seizure. It's better if you have a situation where the physician actually witnesses a seizure, but that tends to be much less common. The things that trigger seizures aren't usually things that you would encounter in a physician's office, and the physician isn't usually out and about watching the patient otherwise. But regardless of how you get there, the seizures have to be either witnessed or verified by a physician. But once you get past that hurdle, then the ratings are dependent, as I mentioned earlier, on the frequency of the episodes, and you can have lay testimony, testimony from any person who's not a physician, explaining the frequency and the types of seizures that are being observed. And the VA adjusts their ratings based upon primarily the frequency and severity of the seizures. The base rating, the 10% rating, they'll grant just based on the need to take seizure medication without you actually suffering actual seizures. But if you're suffering actual seizures, then the rating goes up depending on the frequency. For example, if you're having one major or grand mal seizure every month, they'll give you a 100% rating. 80% if there's one major or grand mal seizure every 3 months, or more than 10 of the minor seizures weekly. And, it goes down from there. So if you have one major seizure every 4 months over the last year, or 9 or 10 minor seizures a week, 60%. And 40% if there's one major seizure in the last 6 months, or 5 to 8 minor seizures. You get the idea.
Now, what are some of the common theories for service connection for these conditions? Because when I think of, epilepsy or narcolepsy, oftentimes it will be hereditary or run in a family, but there are also external factors that can trigger them.
The two most common scenarios that I've seen are the seizures began to manifest while the person was in the service. That's kind of the easy one. Because, as you know, there's a presumption that if you experience the condition during the service, it's service-connected.
If it starts in service, then service-connected as you can get.
Yep. The other is head injuries. It is relatively common for people who experience head injuries to subsequently experience seizures, and frequently migraines as well, but that's a different issue. But it is most common for folks who have a traumatic injury to the head during service to subsequently develop seizures. And so I think it's fair to say that is the most frequent track to service connection.
And just for our viewers, I always like to remind people when traumatic brain injury comes up, loss of consciousness is, by definition, you've suffered a traumatic brain injury. So, if you got knocked out and start experiencing seizures afterward, go to your doctor and tell them about it, because there may be something there.
Oddly enough, we've had actually at least 3, maybe 4 cases where the problem started with the person being a boxer in the service.
Oh, no kidding.
Yep, multiple blows to the head.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even without a loss of consciousness.
Very true. Very true. I was just saying that's the
That's
the
the hallmark,
layperson's
yeah.
bright line.
Yep.
You don't need to be a doctor to know there's been a brain injury when
Yep.
somebody gets knocked out. But I also wanted to ask, as far as service connection goes, what about if there are seizures secondary to a medication? If the medication's required for a condition that's service connected, is there
Yep.
potential claim there?
Yep, that's, as you know, called secondary service connection, meaning it was brought about by a condition that is already connected as having been related to service, called service connected. And so anytime you have a condition that is secondary to that, caused by the medication or anything else, then it will be eligible for service connection. The one that always comes to mind for me is secondary service connection. One of the earliest cases that I worked on, and worked on for a number of years out of New Orleans, was a gentleman who had schizophrenia and glaucoma. And the medications that he took for the schizophrenia would not allow him to take the medications for the glaucoma. And the net result was that they got his schizophrenia under control, but he eventually went blind. And the VA for years fought that claim. They did not want to concede that it was secondary to the treatment for his psychiatric condition, which was service connected. But it was, and we eventually won it. But I do not have fond memories of New Orleans in July.
I understand why. It's a hot and sticky place that time of year.
Was.
But so what about for a veteran who has a seizure disorder prior to enlisting? I know sometimes I'll see somebody will have had childhood seizures, something like that. If symptoms worsen or reoccur in service, is it still possible that the veteran could have a claim there?
Yes. The issue is whether it falls within the category of aggravation. And try to make this as simple as I can. If you enter the service, they give you a physical before you start. And typically, they are supposed to examine you and determine if you have any existing medical conditions. And obviously, you're supposed to give them a medical history as well. If you enter the service, even with a history of epileptic seizures or any other condition, narcolepsy, whatever, they're supposed to determine whether that condition is disabling and they shouldn't take you or not. And they're supposed to record that as part of your intake physical. If they take you in and they don't determine that you have a disabling epileptic condition, even if you may have listed a history of childhood seizures, then once you're in the service, there is a presumption that any condition that you had prior to service, which worsens, was worsened as a result of the service. Now, the VA can rebut that presumption by showing clear and convincing evidence that that's not the case. But that's a very high standard and difficult for them to make. So it depends a great deal on what they determined and what history was given at the time of entry into service. But if you have a history of epileptic seizures as a child and the physician that's examining you thinks that you're okay and able to serve, then if the seizures recur, in all probability you would be able to make a claim based on aggravation.
This is one that has been a perennial problem, and it crops up with other episodic conditions. But what are veterans supposed to do if they're given a CMP exam for narcolepsy, epilepsy, and they go in, it's a good day? What are the chances that they're going to have an event or episode during the C&P exam. Half the time C&P examiners haven't taken a thorough look at the medical records. What should veterans do when they're in that situation to ensure that the C&P exam isn't used to deny their claim?
Well, I like to recommend to veterans that if they have a condition that's not going to be obvious at the time of the exam, they take records and ask the examiner to review them. Now, I'll tell you that in all candor, the examiner doesn't always review them, but there's literally no downside to taking the records and asking the examiner to review them. And if the examiner is competent and has integrity, they will probably look at them. Unfortunately, as you know, in the current medical system, physicians often don't get much time to do exams. And because these are contracted exams and they're not being done by somebody who's looking to treat the veteran, it may be done quite hastily sometimes, and the examiner may not take the time to look at any records that you brought. But there isn't a better method that I know of other than to bring records and to describe the types of episodic occurrences that you're having, whether it's epilepsy or something else. I think that's the best you can do.
We're almost out of time for today, but I wanted to ask what your advice would be for a veteran who, knows something is wrong but doesn't have a clear narcolepsy, epilepsy, or other diagnosis. I know a lot of people, and especially veterans, can have a hard time accessing health care. What options do they have?
Well, obviously, the preferred option is to try and get medical care, and as you know, the Affordable Care Act, sometimes called Obamacare, is usually available to most people at a relatively affordable cost. So I encourage people to go that route. If someone's on SSI or Social Security disability, they're probably eligible for Medicare or Medicaid, although we've heard a lot about the recent bill which will probably cut that back. But if you can't get a medical exam of your own, I would certainly encourage the veteran to apply for the condition and try to get a C&P exam from the VA. C&P exams are a mixed bag, and they will pick up the problem. As I said, it's a mixed bag, and so the converse is also true. Sometimes they're not done well. But it's a free opportunity to get a medical examination. Whether it will come out the way you want it to is a different question, but it's at least a free shot if there's nothing else.
Yeah. And I guess if you can couple that with, a really thorough diary of episodes and symptoms and dates, times, durations, etc.,
Yep.
that would probably be one of the most direct and inexpensive ways to
Yep.
at least get it looked at.
And I would encourage people to, if there's someone living in the household who has witnessed these events, to take them with them to the C&P exam and ask the examiner to talk to them about what happened. Again, the examiner won't always do it, but there's no harm in trying.
Yeah. Well, thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Victory Over VA. Please be sure to like and subscribe and join us again next week.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.